Is Alberta banning books in schools? Yes, this story is rearing its ugly head. Again, because the provincial government of Alberta, in their new policies, dictated that books with sexually explicit content should be taken out of libraries. And everybody's least favorite Canadian author, Margaret Atwood, author of the awful book The Handmaid's Tale, of course, is coming after Alberta with a vengeance. Because Margaret Atwood, as we've discussed before on the briefing, is the kind of person who thinks that she's a martyr simply because government schools don't want to proactively pay for her book and provide it to students. And so there's an article in CTV here, and I want to kind of give you an update on this Alberta book ban because most of what is in the public press is garbage. Margaret Atwood is taking aim at Alberta's controversial ban on school library books containing sexual content with a new satirical short story after the famed author's novel The Handmaid's Tale was yanked from some shelves due to the province's sweeping new rules. It is entirely reasonable and would have been seen as reasonable by any previous generation that books detailing sexually explicit things should be removed from libraries. The reason that Danielle Smith's United Conservative government brought in these rules is because school libraries were both providing and in some cases recommending books with pornographic scenes in them, not only written pornographic scenes, but graphic novels that featured homosexual fellatio, that featured explicit, graphic, step-by-step depictions of various sex acts. These books are not appropriate, at the least, for school children, and the government should not be paying for these books and providing them to students. Of course, nobody can say that anymore because LGBT activists started off by accusing all those who said that they wanted to sexualize children as being bigoted and homophobic, and now are furious when people object to them attempting to do just that. So, in a social media post on Sunday, Margaret Atwood said that since the literary classic is no longer suitable in Alberta schools, she has written a short story for 17-year-olds about two very good children named John and Mary. Now, I'm going to actually do a dramatic reading of Margaret Atwood's short story because it kind of showcases the kind of literary talent that Alberta school children are going to be denied. And I'm sure once I'm completed, I've finished reading this very short story, that you too will be heartbroken that the children of Alberta will no longer be exposed to such genius. So this is about John and Mary. They never picked their noses or had bowel movements or zits. They grew up and married each other and produced 5 perfect children without ever having sex. But while doing that, The Handmaid's Tale came true and Premier Danielle Smith found herself with a nice blue dress but no job. The end. I don't think the CTV quoted the whole thing, so there might be a couple of missing things. Yes, because so John and Mary also paid no attention to the poor and forgiving your enemies and such. Instead, they practiced selfish, rapacious capitalism, which one could argue Atwood is doing by insisting that the government purchase her books, which gives her royalties, and then those books can be supplied to kids. So this story is obviously, well, A, not a story, but B, it's a deliberate exercise in missing the point because there are only 2 possibilities here. One, Margaret Atwood is genuinely too thick to understand that the government does not want to supply books with sexually explicit scenes, including graphic novels, to children. Due to the fact that diversity is Alberta's strength, and most parents believe that explaining these things to their kids is their jobs, not the schools, and certainly not books written by queer activists. Or number 2, Margaret Atwood understands that that's the point, but decides instead to pretend the government's trying to bubble wrap kids by avoiding stuff about picking noses and bowel movements or zits. Like, how old are we? Are you kidding me? So there's really one of 2 options, and neither make Atwood look good. And then, of course, she ends by taking Premier Danielle Smith, who is a pro-choice, pro-gay libertarian, and insists that she's going to be a victim of The Handmaid's Tale. And The Handmaid's Tale, in case you've had the good fortune of never having read the book, refers to the high-ranking wives of commanders in her book, who wore blue while the handmaids in red garments were subjected to produce children for elite couples in totalitarian and theocratic states. So in other words, Margaret Atwood's book, for those of you who haven't read it, I actually have it somewhere in the office here, actually. This book is basically about a rape culture in which young women are raped as concubines for a so-called Christian fascistic elite. And Margaret Atwood is deeply offended that her book about women being systematically raped to produce children for a Christian fascistic elite would not be appropriate for Alberta's school children, because apparently she doesn't understand these kinds of things. So here's what how CTV summarized the process. The Edmonton Public School Board intends to pull 200 titles from library shelves following a directive from the provincial government, according to a document shared with CBC News. Alberta's premier says the directive was to keep out sexually explicit content. And that is the case. Again, on X, there's been all kinds of extremely graphic photos from these books that were put out online. They were retweeted by National Post journalists. Again, this stuff is objectively pornographic. So it's the second time Atwood has weighed in on a provincial book ban. The Canadian author took to social media Friday to encourage people to get copies of The Handmaid's Tale before they have public book burnings of it. This woman will stoop at absolutely to nothing in order to get people to purchase her book. It's like, soon will be banned. You can order this dumb book on Amazon and have it delivered to you almost immediately. Nobody's going to burn Atwood's book. Nobody should buy it because it's a pretty boring book. It's not well written. It gets way more hype than it deserves. There are many dystopian fictional accounts that are far more effective at portraying reality. The Children of Men by P.D. James, for anybody who's interested. But at the end of the day, she's using every single discussion about whether or not pornographic material should be permitted in school libraries as an opportunity to present herself as a martyr and plug for her book. Don't read it, your hair will catch fire, she wrote. No, it won't. Last week, the Edmonton Public School Board, one of Alberta's largest, announced that it was yanking more than 200 books to comply with a July order by Alberta's Education Ministry to remove books from school libraries that carry materials containing explicit sexual content. Now, here's what the school board is doing, and we see this very commonly done by progressive trustees or lower governments that want to essentially attempt to make a reasonable policy look unreasonable. And so the list of books they're removing include Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, and George Orwell's 1984. Now, I've read George Orwell's 1984. It's a genius book. There is definitely some stuff in there that younger kids should not be reading. Animal Farm, fine. A lot of Orwell's work, highly recommended. 1984 has some very mature themes, and it's not up to schools to decide what they're mature enough for. The Color Purple, which is a story about rape by Alice Walker. The Godfather and Jaws also made the list, along with offerings from authors like George R.R. Martin and Philip Roth. Now, this was wild. So George R.R. Martin is an author of the famously pornographic trilogy, the Game of Thrones, or sorry, I believe it's more than a trilogy now. I have read about 4 pages of Game of Thrones. I was in a bookstore and I picked it off the shelf because everybody was talking about the book, and I just flipped it open to the middle and decided to read a couple of pages. And in those pages were graphic scenes of sexual assault and women constantly referred to by the C word, and the writing was also pretty subpar. And I put the book back on the shelf and never looked at it again. I can't believe they have this stuff in the library to begin with. You're supplying books to kids that feature graphic and consistent scenes of sexual assault, sexual torture, sexual degradation, and women being referred to as the C word, and you're presenting that in an article that's making the case against the book ban. And Philip Roth is one of the most graphically sexual writers, one of the most graphically sexual writers of the latter half of the 20th century. So he's very famous, and for a writing project I had to do, I picked up one of his books, and the stuff in there is absolutely inappropriate for school children. Much of it is inappropriate for anybody. And so Danielle Smith's response here, and I think this is the right response, she said that Edmonton's public school board had gone over the top in complying with the ban, and the division's list is a form of vicious compliance. Now, vicious compliance basically means they're going to take the rule and they're going to obey the letter of the rule, not the spirit of the rule. So Danielle Smith is referring to books like Genderqueer and Flamer, and for that matter, George R.R. Martin's books, which are graphic depictions of sex and sexuality, and often graphic depictions of a diversity of sex acts and sexual torture. Instead, what they're doing is they're going to look through every single classic book that contains any reference to sexuality and pull it off the shelf to give people like Margaret Atwood the opportunity to pretend that Danielle Smith, the libertarian, is trying to usher in A Handmaid's Tale. It's a really transparent tactic, but the CBC, the CTV, etc., all go along with it. In a statement, School Board Chair Julie Kusiak said that the list meets the criteria set out by the government, and anyone unhappy with it should contact Alberta Education Minister Demetrius Nicolaides. So in other words, they're going to take this as far as they possibly can and tell people, hey, the Alberta Education Minister doesn't want you to read George Orwell. Interesting, isn't it? It's such a transparent tactic. And so actually earlier this week, the Education Minister posted lists online. And so he's basically saying, well, here's his tweet. Over the past few months, I have seen several comments from Albertans asking for proof that these books existed in Alberta schools. The books he's referenced are the very pornographic graphic novels that Danielle Smith referenced at her press conference about these policies. The education minister continues, I initially did not share this list as I did not feel drawing attention to individual schools was necessary or helpful. However, I believe Albertans deserve transparency. Please see below a list of which schools had these books. And it is a very long list here. If I read just a couple, Centre High, Jasper Place, Strathhorse, Victoria, it's pretty much all the schools were carrying these books because LGBT curriculum is recommended by a lot of school boards. And then he includes at the end of it a bunch of photos of very graphic sexual manga books. Again, these are graphic novels. The book Genderqueer, which involves step-by-step photographs of people giving each other oral sex. The book Flamer. And so he's giving all of the evidence, but here's the thing, is those criticizing a policy of keeping sexually explicit material out of libraries first claim that they're trying to keep George Orwell and other books out of the library, and when the minister here provides evidence that no, this is what we were talking about and this is what the policy was targeting, now they'll come out and say, well, those books are essential for LGBT students. So they're going to use whatever argument they think works. But anyways, this is basically the tactic that we can expect to see from here on out, is anytime you claim to be attempting to restrict pornographic material in libraries, everybody goes nuts. And Jonathon Kay, actually, the National Post writer, had a pretty good summary of this on his X. He said this tiresome culture war script keeps playing out. 1, government rightly tells libraries to stop stocking porn. 2, librarians rightly note that kids who want porn will look for it online, so who cares, but overplay their hand by wrongly claiming that being anti-porn is also being anti-LGBT, etc. 3, government rightly denounces this as BS. And 4, librarians stunningly and bravely raise the stakes and delight their 17 followers by grandstanding as porn-positive fetish allies. And then 5, literary grandees such as Margaret Atwood now imagine that protecting the 4 unread copies of Heather Has 3 Penises, an erotic pop-up adventure for pie-spirited gender knots, is the civil liberty cause of our millennium. 6, government returns to step 1, rinse and repeat. That pretty much sums it up. Thank you so much for listening to The Bridgehead today. If you found the commentary helpful, again, please do like the video or share it around. Subscribe to the channel. That's very helpful for us. And thank you so much for your time. We'll see you again next week.